Think about the iOS and Swift ecosystem today. We touch open source in pretty much everything that we do. The language that we write is open source, the dependency managers that we use, the way we display web views, the way we manage our data. We need open source to do mobile development. But it hasn't always been the case. So if we look back to the 1950s, when computing was done mostly in academia, on massive computers, pretty much all software had to include the source code in order for you to be able to run it. We didn't really have standardized hardware, so if you got a piece of software, you had to modify and tinker it to make it work with the setup that you had. This changed in 1974, when it became possible to copyright software. And this led to the rise of big closed source projects like DOS. The one person who kind of stood up against this was Richard Stillman from MIT. He started a free software movement. The goal of the free software movement was to create a free alternative to Unix. And even though it didn't quite work out as expected, it really set the foundation for free software. It inspired Linus Law to create Linux, which was the first sort of successful open source free operating system. And this in turn inspired this book, The Cathedral and the Bazaar by Eric S. Raymond. In the book, he talks about the process of creating Linux and everything that the team learned along the way. And it was hugely influential. And when the founders of Netscape read it, they decided to share the source code for Netscape. And that was a very weird decision in the 90s. People didn't really understand it. And they didn't really understand what free meant. What is free in free software? Famously, they used to say that by free, they mean free as in freedom, not as in free beer. But there were still loads of questions. So they set up this symposium and tried to rebrand the free software movement. And that's kind of how we ended up with the term open source. It was the founding of the Open Source Initiative. And open source is defined on opensource.com as software with source code that anyone can inspect, modify, and enhance. It's 2018, beautiful day in Krakow, and open source is really at the foundation of most modern technology. It runs our servers, our phones, electric cars, everything. We share everything in order to push technology forward. My personal journey with open source started about 3 years ago. And I got really, really into it. And I created a bunch of frameworks like Phone Number Kit for passing phone numbers, or Spotify login for logging into Spotify. And it was really, really fun. And they've been quite popular. They've been used by a bunch of apps, and people seem to like them. So I get to speak to a lot of people who want to talk about open source. And when I speak to people, everyone says that they're really interested, and they really want to get involved, and really want to be part of it. But they don't know how, and very few people actually create open source projects and contribute. So the reason why I wanted to give this talk is to change that. So I really want to inspire you to create your own open source project, to understand how to do it and how rewarding it can be. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to start by looking at some great reasons to get involved and why you should do open source. Then we're going to look at how to, what should you open source and how to identify that and create it. And then how to open source well and create a successful project. And we're going to do all of this with kind of the Swift iOS lens, but it's a multi-track conference, so if you're not doing that, I'm sure that it will still be relevant. So why should you do open source? What are good reasons? There's a bunch of code reasons. So going back to Linus, in The Cathedral and Bazaar, there's this quote saying that given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. This became known as Linus's Law. And basically the idea is that if you have an open source code base where everyone can inspect the code, bugs get discovered quicker and get resolved quicker. And just by putting a lot of developers and a lot of minds together, we can create higher quality software. And this sounds nice, but it's also a bit suspicious. So there have been a number of studies, empirical studies, and they show that yes, open source is often much better quality than closed source because of this group effect that we have. So if you want to write better code, open source the code. Another part is just the fact that you're creating this framework that needs to stand alone really makes you think about, like, it has to follow solid principles. You need to have great separation of concerns. Things need to be generalized and modular. And you really need to think about what kind of APIs you expose. So if you, for example, want to take a utility from your app and open source it, you need to answer all of these questions and make it much more reusable and sort of much better code. The other kind of code issue is that there are problems that you just can't solve on your own. So one great example of this is Bazel, which is Google's internal build system that they've built for their own apps and services. And basically, by open sourcing it, it's the only way they can make a general tool for everyone, because everyone has different build problems and build systems, and it's pretty much impossible to answer that kind of problem internally. There are a lot of personal reasons to do open source. I strongly believe that open source is the greatest way to grow your skills as a developer. A lot of us work for companies or agencies, and a lot of the code that we write is usually under NDAs, and there are things that you can't share. And there's a great benefit of having code that you write that exists in the open. Not only that, but you will get pull requests from people who might be smarter than you, and you might learn something from them. And also there are all these things that I mentioned about reusability and all of the things that you need to do around open sourcing your code that really help you become a better developer. Another reason, and this is kind of this sort of selfish ego reason, but it's really nice to get GitHub stars. You feel a little bit like Kardashian or something, and people get, you build a reputation for yourself, and that feels good, and it feels good to know that the work that you've done is used out there. And the last reason, which is one that people don't talk so much about, but I've seen it in a lot of places, is that if you're working for a company or on a project, and there's a part of the project that you really enjoy and you want to keep using and keep contributing to, that's been a reason for people to open source stuff a lot in the future. And some of the best projects that we have kind of started life that way, of just trying to externalize a solution from a company or a project. If you're trying to convince your company to open source things, there are a lot of business reasons to do that as well. I think the best one is about giving back. So we said that open source is in the foundation of modern technology and a lot of the companies that we work for. And it only makes sense for us to continue contributing to this shared pool of knowledge, to keep pushing technology forward. It's also a great way for a company to showcase the skills in the company and its ability to solve hard problems and the sort of the qualities of their engineers. And in theory, that will also affect hiring. You want to work for a company that does super exciting open source. There are many more reasons, and I hope some of these resonated with you, but if not, let's have a chat afterwards and I can give you some more. So let's say you're convinced you want to open source something, you want to get involved in the open source community. What should you open source? I wanted to start with a couple of myths. So there are a few beliefs that people seem to have. And one of them is that everything that you open source needs to be new and novel and original. And I really disagree with this. So Phone Number Kit, which is this framework for passing phone numbers, is basically a port of a solution that already existed on Java and JavaScript and even in Objective-C. And just creating a new version of it in Swift that had better tests and was lightweight and was more Swifty, that was useful for the community. People liked that and people enjoyed using it. There's another myth that your solution has to be really smart, really genius solution. And I also disagree with this one. So another one of sort of the earliest frameworks that I worked on was localized Swift. And what localized Swift simply does is just a nicer syntax for working with localization. There's nothing genius about it. It's a couple of lines of code. But still, it really helps people do localization in their app. And that can still be very useful without it being clever. The last thing is that your solution needs to be obviously useful. And my example for this is TV Button, which is a framework that I did after getting my first Apple TV. And I was really excited about the parallax effect in icons, and I wanted to try and recreate that on iOS. And that's pretty much it. And I can't see why anyone would like to use it. I didn't want to use it. It's just a nice challenge that you set yourself, and people still like it, and they want to check it out, and also want to see, how do you do this kind of thing? Back in the cathedral in the bazaar, Eric S. Raymond says that every good work of software starts by scratching a developer's personal itch. And if you have this itch, the thing that you're super passionate about, that you really want to share with the community, that's a really great place to start. But we've got work to do, we're busy people. Sometimes the itch that we have is not so obvious. We don't really know what it is. So is there anything for us to open source? I think so. So we all have utilities like little things that we write for ourselves to make our workflow better, to make us more productive. Share those. If you're a consultant and you go between different projects, different companies, you will notice that there's common work. There's work that you're doing in all the projects that either you need to do again and again and again, or you already have an internal framework that you've created for this. This is also a great target for open sourcing. If you work for a company, you have internal frameworks, internal tools that don't have anything secret about how your company works, that could be shared. And say if you don't have any of these, you can always go to the people in the Android track and ask them about what kind of solutions exist on Android, and if there's something that would make a lot of sense on iOS, and same for web. And you can just port a solution over. And otherwise, just set yourself a personal challenge. Try and create something that you don't know how to create. And the zip framework that I have started life as just me trying to figure out how to integrate C from Swift. So everyone has something that they can open source that will be useful for the community and that you can share with people. So how do we open source well? I think the key idea here, and this is if there's one thing you take away from this talk, let it be this, is that your project is kind of like a product. You're trying to launch a product that you want other people to use. So if we want a successful one, what do we mean by success? Personally, I see a successful open source project as one that acquires users and acquires developers. And usually it's the same people. We want people to integrate your framework in their app and then be excited about it, to want to help evolve it and help contribute. So if we do this, we put on the marketing business hat. What do developers want? What do developers care about? How do we get developers excited about the work that we do? I think ultimately we want an easier life. We want to take something that's really hard, make it very easy, and that's amazing value for developers. Another thing that we want, and it's if you're trying to evaluate a third-party project to include in your app, you want it to be a high-quality project. You want it to have good testing, good code coverage, and you want to know that when you integrate it, it won't bring with it a bunch of problems. You also want it to be simple and maintainable, and simple to use, simple to integrate, but also, and this is a worry for me when I integrate a third-party framework, if it's very complicated, what will happen if the current maintainer leaves? Do I have to rewrite the app, or do I have to can I start maintaining this thing? Is it too complicated? So it's very important to keep things as simple as possible while still being useful. Another thing is community social proof. You want to integrate a framework that you know other people are using, that it's widely used in the community, or that there's a big company behind it with delivering products. And I think a lot of these are captured quite nicely in the CocoaPod's quality metrics. So if you go on CocoaDocs, pretty much every framework, they do these calculations for and give them a score on basically how well they answer these kind of questions. So I came up with this list of 10 simple steps of things that you need to do to open source well. And you need to isolate and review your code, document, name, version, legalize, readme, distribution, example app, miscellaneous, and launch. And it's quite a lot to keep in mind and remember, so I have a handy mnemonic for you, Readme, so it's easy to remember. And I mean, it sounds like a lot, it's not actually that much, and usually it takes a couple of days, and we're not going to talk about all of them, we're going to talk just about a select few things. So the D in that horrible word is documentation, sorry. So we have this little shortcut in Xcode, alt-command \, and when you do that on a function, it gives you all the boilerplate for documentation. Now, when you talk to developers, I think a lot of you in your teams, there's this idea that if your code is simple enough, code should be sort of self-documenting. But when you want to open source something, I think that doesn't really work, because it might be thousands of people, and they all come from different backgrounds, and even when things are easy to understand for you, it won't be easy to understand for them. So having clear documentation really, really helps. And if you want inspiration for this, look at Apple and the way Apple document. when they do, they do it really, really well. One great tool for this is Jazzy from Realm. So this is a framework you can get. And when you run Jazzy, it creates HTML docs from your inline documentation. And it also gives you this percentage of documentation coverage for public methods. And really try to hit 100. And I think this is like a great tool to really check how well you're doing on this. And then another thing you need to do is really review your APIs. Like it's not just about documenting the APIs that you have. It's about making sure that you have APIs that are really simple, that can't really be used in a way that breaks everything. And it's something that, again, we don't do that much when we're just working on our own project. The other thing I wanted to mention is the legal side of things. So that's the legalization part. If you want to do this within a company, can you actually do it? For us at Spotify, we have a process around this, and I think I was talking to people from Google, they have a very similar one. First of all, you need to check that the thing that you want to open source doesn't include anything secret. So for us, like, we're not going to open source the Discover Weekly algorithm, but we might open source like a developer tool that we have. Then there's like a bunch of bureaucratic things. You need manager approval, you need to put copyright in header files. And like the really interesting one is software review. So usually when you open source something, you do code reviews for PRs that are incoming, but you don't really do code reviews for the initial, like, the initial first commit. And it's really, really useful to do that. So we have basically a pool of engineers who volunteer to do software reviews, and they do a very extensive code review of like the entire framework and making sure that everything works as expected, that the API is clear, that things are well documented, that the syntax is nice. All the things we look at when we do code reviews, and it's super, super useful. So if you want to open source something, even if you're not doing it in a company, try and find someone to do this like initial code review and have another pair of eyes on it. And then there's like the legal approval stuff. The legal stuff, basically you need a license. There are loads and loads of open source licenses. These are the 3 most popular ones. MIT is a very permissive license. Essentially what it means is just take this code, do what you want with it, as long as you like put credit to where you took it from. Apache is kind of similar in the permissiveness. It's very, very similar, but it's a bit longer, and it includes more sort of legal wording around patents and not being sued. So if you're worried about the legal side of things, maybe Apache is slightly better. And then GPL is on the other side of the spectrum. It's a bit more restrictive, and it says that basically if you want to use this piece of source code, the thing using it also needs to have a GPL license and be open source. The R stands for Readme. Again, we said like this is a product, you want to launch it to developers. And the place where developers will go and try and evaluate your project is in the Readme file. And when I was looking at Readmes before I made my own projects, I noticed that a lot of the good ones follow a similar kind of structure. So I'm going to show it to you with the Fastlane Readme. So basically what they do well is you have to really answer very, very quickly, what is this project? What does it do? Then you need to give a very simple example of how to use it and what can you do with it. And it really doesn't have to be very complicated. Next, you want to have a list of features so people know like all of the things they can possibly do with this framework and what makes it great. Then you need a bunch of instructions about how to set it up, which are usually just copy-pasted between all of the different open source frameworks. And then just links for digging deeper and getting more involved. Couple of things. So first of all, naming is important. In Swift, like we started with a lot of Swifty frameworks, like Swifty JSON, and now we kind of moved away to more simple naming. Have a name that really feels like it's part of the ecosystem that you're trying to contribute to. Another thing that's really important is a logo. It sounds weird, but like it's a very small investment to do, and people will take your project much more seriously when you create a logo for it. If your framework has any implications on UI or any sort of UI use cases, including a GIF showing how it works, it's great. And then you really need to put like an example app. And we said in the README you have a very simple example of how to use it. And in the example app you can go a bit deeper and show something more complex. So how do you do a good example app? It needs to be, again, something that's usually hard, but your frameworks makes easy. And if you're doing this for a company, it's a great place to show off the company product and like what kind of context this framework was created for originally. And it's also like a great way to test your installation on the CI. So I use my example apps to test that the Carthage and CocoaPods installations keep working. I think this is a great example of an example app. So this is from Async Display Kit, which Facebook created to have 60 frames per second scrolling on their feeds. And in their example, basically you just have an Instagram feed, and they'll show you how bad it is without Async Display Kit, how good it is with it. And you really get like the sense of what this thing was created for. And yeah, it really inspires you to create complicated things. Another important thing is versioning. So versioning is another thing we don't think about that much when we're working on our apps. But when you're thinking about a framework, both as a user of the framework and as the maintainer, you want to have a certain set of guarantees. You want to know that if you update the framework, whether it will break everything or whether it will continue working as expected. And as a maintainer, you want to make sure that there's always a version that you can continue using, that people can continue using. So semantic versioning is the popular way of doing versioning for open source projects. And it basically divides the version number into 3 buckets. You have this major bucket, minor bucket, and a patch bucket. And the way it works is that if you have incompatible API changes, you bump the major number. If you have backwards compatible functionality that's new, that's usually a minor bump. And bug fixes that are backwards compatible just get a patch bump. And what you'll find if you start using this is that this is not really an exhaustive list, and you find there are a lot of great cases where you don't really know what to do. What happens if your like just the version of Swift changes? If it changes from 3 to 4, that's a big change. That should be like maybe even a major release. But if it's like a small thing from 4.2 to from 4.1 to 4.2, what do you do? So there are a lot of guides and a lot of conversations on Twitter and on the internet that will help you make these kind of decisions. When you want to do versioning for your app, Apple have their Apple generic versioning system that you can enable from the build settings. And it makes life a lot easier. So you just go to the terminal, you do AGV tool, new marketing version, and it automatically changes all of the plist and versioning files in your project. And it makes life much, much nicer. So you've done all of these things. You want to launch it. Don't soft launch it. So this is a mistake that a lot of people do, just like putting it out there and hoping people find it. People won't just find your project. You need to build buzz around it, like make it an event. So how do you launch well? First of all, talk to your colleagues and local community. A lot of us have Cocoa Heads near where we live. Try and go there and explain why you built this thing. Talk to people, get them excited. Another thing you can do is write a short Medium post. So Medium, for better or worse, like it's a very easy place to write, and you can write a very short piece about like the motivation behind creating this framework, and then give like a different example, maybe from your README, and you have something that's very easy to share across the internet and send to people, and yeah, have them know why you made things. Reddit and Hacker News are great places to get attention. Our iOS, our Swift on Reddit and on Hacker News just in general. You post things, and if people like it, they will upvote it, and other people will find it. We also have a lot of community newsletters. We have iOS Dev Weekly, iOS Goodies, a lot of the Swift ones. Those are great places where people who want to try new things, like, check it out. And like, if the creators of the newsletters like what you did, they will share it, and people will find it that way. We also have these aggregators, Awesome iOS and Awesome Swift. These are just massive Markdown files on GitHub. You can add your framework there, do a pull request, and people might discover it. So you've done all this work. You're ready to launch your framework. You're very excited. What happens next? Good things happen. So it gets popular. People use it. That's really exciting. You start trending on GitHub. You see your name up there with all of the other frameworks. That's really cool. And you get invited to conferences in Poland. That's really exciting. And you get pull requests that just blow your mind, that completely redefine how you wanted to solve this problem in the first place and make your solution like a million times better than you thought it would be. And you find your name in like apps that you use. That's really weird. And you're very, very happy. And that's it, the end. However, there's one more thing. So this trending thing that you got really, really excited, that really doesn't last that long. Like 1 week, 2 weeks later, you don't trend anymore. And the stars that got you so excited, that you got this sort of buzz from, they don't really correspond to usage. It's just people bookmarking something that they read about. And I don't know, like one example for this is Objective-Kit, which is a framework that I did for interacting with the runtime from Swift. Like, it has a bunch of stars and like 0 usage almost. Generally, like the interest graph, if you had to graph it for your project, it looks like this. It has this sort of asymptotic line, and all the excitement is in the beginning, and then it just wanes over time. The biggest mistake that you can make is not to use this initial momentum, the initial excitement, to harness that into creating a community, to make something that's much more sustainable. Ash Farah wrote a blog post about his experience with Moya, saying that whenever someone had made a pull request, he gave them write access. And that's a really great technique for really building a community around your project. There's very little you can lose from this, and it works really well in my experience. So you get these PRs and issues coming in over time, and the ones that were super brilliant before, like they become a bit rarer, and you get a lot of support requests and a lot of weird questions, and like PRs from people who want to take your framework in like a completely different direction from the one that you wanted, and it gets kind of exhausting. It's really important to still be nice and welcoming for all of these people. Like, people want to contribute, they want to be part of this, they're taking their free time to do these things. It's important to do this even though it's so tiring when you do it on your own. Going back to Linus, he's very famous for like awful code reviews. There's this one of just kill yourself now. And I don't know if you follow the news, but he just like took a break from maintaining Linux in order to reevaluate how he talks to people, which is great, but it's not a great job being a maintainer. It's really, really hard. And what makes it easy is having this community, having people helping you to not burn out, to deal with all of this incoming stuff and really make your framework sustainable and exist to the future. So if you want to do it well, like building community is absolutely essential. So let's wrap things up. Open source is super, super, super exciting. There are many, many great reasons for you to get involved and be part of this journey. You can launch a successful project, and you know what you need to do and all of the steps you need to do. And you can learn from your mistakes and really think about a community earlier on. And I think like trying to do the community thing later is harder. And all you need to do now is just go home and write something awesome and share it with everyone. And that's it. Thanks. And I was told that for questions, there are like awards that people get prizes. So I think the first and second question get a prize. So if there are questions, you'll get, I think it's speakers, right?
Thank you. Thanks for a great talk. I'm just open sourcing something, so it's
amazing.
It's really great to hear some advices. So you have said about starting. So if you release a new open source project, yeah. You said that you need to take advantage of this and spread a word everywhere about it. But is that needed that this project at the beginning is well documented, well tested, etc., or just spread the word everywhere and fill things later? What would you say about this?
Again, like think as the person, as the user of the framework, would you integrate a framework that has like bad documentation and bad testing? And like, I think answering all of these things early and sort of launching from a good position, that's what you should aim for.
Okay, so you say that I should wait a week longer and fill things up and then launch with big words everywhere.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Cool.
Hello. You said that you can avoid burning out by having community, but what is your advice when it happens? Because it happens, you burn out, how do you proceed?
I don't know, the time it happened to me with a project. Like, I think deprecating a project is probably the best thing for you and for the users if you don't intend to maintain it and if it makes you miserable and it just went in completely the wrong direction. And I think, yeah, you can always do that. And if someone's really passionate about it, they can take it on. So I think that happened also with Jesse Squires and his messaging framework. So it was too much for him, and then the community took it on and became an organization. But like, yeah, if it's too much for you, there's no point in continuing to do it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. So I've got one more, not maybe iOS specific question, but what do you think, or maybe what Spotify think about code of conduct in open sources? Because now I think everybody knows, for example, Linus' opinion on that. It's not quite good. So what do you think about it? Is it good for open source or?
Yeah, I think it's great. Like, it's at Spotify, it's a requirement, so we have to have a code of conduct. I think it's very useful. You want to make it a welcoming place for people to contribute. And yeah, like having a contributing file and a code of conduct is pretty essential.
Okay, thank you.
I think that's all. Thank you, Roy.
Thank you.